Professor Wiesner, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start with the first question. How do you define European identity? Is there a European identity? What are the problems and contradictions when we try to define a European identity? Has the EU been successful in constructing a European identity?
That's a question that is really, really difficult to answer in a short way. So let me start with a yes or no. I wouldn't say there is a yes or no answer to this, but there is the glass half full or half empty answer to this. So there are elements of a European identity, such as, for instance, people identifying with the European Union as a polity, people participating in European elections. We saw a relatively high turnout in the EP elections last time, which shows that people think the EU is a relevant polity and is relevant as a political level. We see currently in Germany a football competition with people from all over Europe, and we see Germany's tabloid Bild saying Europe is a great country. So there are a number of indications that there are elements and dimensions of a European identity. So EU citizens feel European. There are also Eurobarometer data saying that people see themselves as European, people think membership of their country in the EU is a good thing, and so on. So there are a number of indicators that there is something in this glass of European identity. Now, in the start of the research on European identity, many people wanted it to be compared to national identity. And that is something that we will never reach, if you ask me. So the question, in my view, is not necessarily now, at this moment, whether people would want to die for the European Union, no more, no less, maybe than it might be, or maybe probably it's more the case for a nation state still to ask this question. So we have to face that the ways people identify with the European Union would be different from the ways they identify with a nation state, and that European identity will always be a dual identity. So it will always mean at least that people would say, I'm a German and a European, and probably they would even say, I'm from Frankfurt, I'm a German and I'm a European. So the answer has to be that it is complex, but given this complexity, we have a certain degree of European identity.
All right. How does the rise of populist movements within the EU challenge the formation of a cohesive European identity? And what strategies can be employed to mitigate these challenges while promoting democratic values?
I think it's three things that you are mentioning here: the rise of populism, European identity, and the defense of democratic values. So the rise of populism has multiple causes. There is a huge field of research to which many of my colleagues contribute on populism, indicating that there are a lot of triggers to the rise of populism. Social inequality is one, dissatisfaction with the government is one. Sometimes it's also a surge of nationalism. In several cases, it's an anti-migration stance. So there are several triggers to populism. And the success of populist parties and actors, very broadly speaking, results in mobilizing a feeling of us versus them. So very often populism means a mobilization of a feeling of us versus them. And this feeling is mostly articulated in nationalist terms. So I'm currently doing a project, or I lead a work package in a Horizon project on resilient social contracts. And we just finished a data collection on the European elections. So we collected TikTok videos. And it turns out that TikTok is a social media that shows very well how populist argument works. So we have a strong right-wing extremist / right-wing populist party in Germany, and what they did in their mobilizations is to underline that it's always us versus them. So us then would be in the narratives that the hardworking German citizens, the taxpayers, the average citizen, and them would be those others. The others can then be the governmental elites that are usually portrayed as incompetent or as even corrupt. The others could also be the European Union. The others is not so much, interestingly, as it used to be the French, the Greek, the Belgians. So it's not so much other nations, but the others would be everybody that doesn't fit into a right-wing populist worldview in a way. So the interesting thing is that this is not necessarily directed against the European Union or European identity, but it's a battle about defining a different European identity. And here is it where sort of the values come in. So the European Union has defined values in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. And those values in this article are the classical values of liberal representative democracy. So democracy, freedom, the rule of law, human rights, equality between men and women, etc. And right-wing extremists or right-wing populists would criticize those values to an extent, but they would mainly try to reformulate them, saying, for instance, yes, of course, we are in favor of democracy, but it's democracy the way that we want democracy to be. Or they would say, we are obviously in favor of equality between women and men, but women and men being different, it means that it's a very good thing that women are staying at home when they are mothers and taking care for the children, because it's the women who give care to the children. And they would add, that doesn't mean to treat women and men unequally, it just means that women and men are different, and so on. So it's not that right-wing populist parties would say they are against European identity or against European values, but they would redefine them, saying that the way they are enacted at the moment, it's not in the good way, it's not in favor of the good citizens, it's not in favor of the hardworking people. And we need to redefine that.
All right. In the light of your article titled Actors, Concepts, Controversies, the Conceptual Politics of European Integration, how do the conceptual politics of European integration influence the formation of a European identity, especially in the context of increasing populism across member states?
Conceptual politics is a concept and also a research focus. It's a way of looking at phenomena that we find in the political realm, and it's a way of analyzing them. Conceptual politics means that we need to be sensitive in how people frame concepts and how they use political concepts and how they describe political concepts and how also they are contested. So what I just said about this interpretation, reinterpretation of values of in the European Union and of democracy in the European Union, that's a case of conceptual politics. It's a case of conceptual politics to say the EU claims that the concept of democracy means certain things, and we are of the opinion that it must mean something else. For instance, Viktor Orban would be a case in point. So there is a number of rule of law cases against Hungary that sort of are led by the Court of Justice of the European Union. There are fines, there are infringement procedures against Hungary. And they are based on those values in Article 2. And basically, the Court of Justice of the European Union has judged against Hungary in numerous cases. And the question at hand is to what extent Hungary respects those values. Now, what Viktor Orban does is to do conceptual politics and to say, but we are not at all against democracy. We are very democrat. We are even more democrat than those EU bureaucrats. And he tries to give democracy another definition. Viktor Orban famously coined this term illiberal democracy. And he really, I mean, I'm not sure if he understands himself as a Democrat or not, but what he does is conceptual politics, saying, listen, here's another idea of what democracy is, and that is illiberal democracy, and I suggest that this is the real democracy. So it's a kind of a contestation around the concept of democracy that we see very, very frequently in populism in the moment.
Right. In what ways do populist movements challenge the existing conceptual frameworks of EU integration, and how does this affect the EU's ability to foster a cohesive European identity? Could you please elaborate on the role historical narratives and past conceptual controversies play in shaping current debates on identity and populism within the EU?
I think I think it's okay if we leave out the historical contexts for a moment and start with a very concrete example. I just read that because there is a debate about what alignments, what collaborations will come up in the next European Parliament. And in particular, there is a debate on whether the European People's Party, so the conservatives, the classical conservatives, will collaborate with the let's say right-wing populists or very conservatives, the right fringe of the conservatives, so the European conservatives and reformists, which is among other the Polish Peace Party and Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia. So broadly speaking, we would classify them as somewhere between very conservative and right-wing populist. And I read that the European conservatives and reformists, and also the even more right-wing Identity and Democracy, have voted jointly with the European People's Party when there was a debate on Next Generation EU and Repower EU. So the two main policy packages that the EU does in the moment. So very broadly summarizing, this means that we already see something like a de facto coalition of the classical conservatives and right-wing extremists / right-wing populists when it comes to energy policy. When they voted against harsh climate conditions, when they voted against measures of energy transformation, and that kind of thing. And we also see that sort of what goes along with it is a debate on whether all those measures against climate change are necessary at all. So right-wing populists would strongly argue against climate change measures classically. And not all of this is sort of entirely wrong. Obviously, to change the way industries are structured is a challenge to an economy. So you see these arguments being put forward. So the challenge for the European Union in this is obviously that we have this idea put forward by the Commission, very prominently by Ursula von der Leyen, that the EU needs to become the leading world region when it comes to climate protection. So if the EU wants to be the leading world region when it comes to climate protection, they will have to change the way the economy is organized, and we will need more green industries. This is a thing that goes, for instance, against the German car industries. So the German car industries then will have to change. And we see that the opposition against this comes from Ursula von der Leyen's own camp. So the European People's Party would like to water this goal down. And we see that this is sort of mixed with classical populist arguments against climate protection. And I was saying the thing about the historical dimensions, I'm not really sure to what extent there are any historical parallels in those arguments. I would say it's kind of a very new cleavage around climate change, climate protection that we see at work here. And obviously this cleavage and the debates around it impact the EU and its policies, because the EU has promoted the goal and this goal has been concluded. And when it comes to the nitty-gritty details, so to the law that follows from that, we have a watering down in the European Parliament.
How do the conceptual politics of EU integration address the issues raised by populist rhetoric, especially regarding sovereignty and national identity? And what role do these politics play in either exacerbating or alleviating the tensions between national and European identities?
The interesting thing is that I don't see so many tensions between national and European identities in the moment. So interestingly, I would say that not even Marine Le Pen and not Giorgia Meloni would want to leave the European Union. Viktor Orban doesn't want to leave the European Union. So the European Union is too beneficial. What we see is that political actors like these have a tendency to say, but Hungary first, but France first, but Italy first. So it's not exactly placing the national identity against the European identity, but it's establishing kind of a priority, saying Italy first and then the European Union. Or Italy first, and this means that Italy needs to lead the European Union. For instance, Giorgia Meloni would make strong claims on a restrictive migration policy, and that the European Union should be leading a restrictive migration policy, which is sort of an Italian model. It's a Meloni model, but Meloni currently is the leader of Italy, so it would be sort of an Italian model of having of the policies that the EU should be adopting. So I would say that the conceptual policies, politics in that sense, they don't mean creating an opposition, but they mean creating a sort of priorities, which then sort of means that national identity comes first and national interests come first, and then European interests follow on a second place. And since you asked me to the historical parallels, this is probably something that we see historically a lot in European integration. So this motive of having national identity first is rather an old motive. It has been recurrent ever since European integration began.
How would you assess the recent European Parliament elections compared to former elections of the EP, though the results of EP elections point to a serious crisis of the EU in terms of legitimation?
Yes and no. So on one hand, we really have a very high turnout. We have a lot of people that are really, or that have been really interested in EP elections. We also have a situation in the European Parliament where there is not really like a majority of anti-EU voices. So the estimates with regard to the outcome of the European Parliament election were much more critical for let's say the democratic camp. So the prognosis saw, for instance, identity and democracy at a higher percentage than what they sort of got in the end. So we have something like a pro-European majority in the European Parliament. There is a multi-party majority, multi-party pro-European majority in the European Parliament. Given the volatility of the majorities in the European Parliament, it's probably necessary to have 4 political groups in this majority. And that will obviously raise difficulties in finding majorities, because it would mean that you need to bring the Conservatives, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens under one common roof. Or then, and that's the debate that we see in the moment, if we don't have the Greens, we take parts of European Conservatives and Reformists. Which brings me to the challenges these parliamentary election brings. I think it's really a very dangerous game, still led, I think, or not completely given up by von der Leyen and the European People's Party, who have strong sympathies for collaborating rather with Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia than with the Greens. And sincerely, I don't even see the strategic interest behind that, because these are not people that would support a strong European integration. These are parties that would, I think, always be in favor of a weaker Europe, whereas the Greens would always be in favor of a stronger Europe. So I think it would be in the interest of a strong European Commission to choose a party that is in favor of a stronger European Union. So I really have problems to understand the strategic rationality behind these sort of eyes cast on the Conservatives and Reformists. That's one thing. And the second thing is that the European Union obviously is based on those articles lined out in Article 2. And the European Union already has those rule of law conflicts. And if now the major fraction group in the European Parliament collaborates with other groups that have in the past been acting against those articles and the rule of law and the values defined in Article 2, then obviously that can create a legitimacy problem. It will create a legitimacy problem for the European Union. Because how how shall citizens believe Ursula von der Leyen when she says she wants to defend democracy, when she collaborates with a Giorgia Meloni who is currently destroying media liberty in Italy, when she collaborates with a Polish PiS who has sort of pushed forward democratic backsliding in Poland. So obviously that means that this idea of defense of the rule of law is just might even appear as a lie. And this is something that people recognized. I have been in many public discussions, and it's something that even sort of the average citizens, not only EU scholars, but the average citizens realize that there is a problem there. So my point would be that if the European Union wants to be credible in defending its values, it needs to defend these values also on the inside.
In your book, Politicization, Democratization, and the European Identity, you argue that the EU appears as a kind of defective democracy. Where do these deficiencies stem from, and how can they be fixed? What can be done to reduce democratic deficiency of the EU?
This is a very broad question. So this model of defective democracy doesn't come from EU research, but it comes from the neighboring field of political science research on the quality of democracy. And it's a category between full-fledged representative democracies and autocracies. So a defective democracy would be a democracy that doesn't show all the criteria of a fully functioning liberal representative democracy. An EU politician put this famously into the wording: if the EU was asked to accept herself as a member, she would have to decline it because the EU doesn't meet the rule of law standards. So the list is long. There's a long debate on the democratic deficit in the European Union, and some of the criticisms are still valid. And my main point in the moment would be the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability. In brief, that the EU is too complicated and too complex. That would sort of be the main point that I see. I lead a number of research projects that look at citizen views on the European Union. And this is really a recurring point that always pops up. The EU is just too complex. It's just too complicated. So citizens don't understand what's going on. And that obviously creates a legitimacy problem, because how can you think a political system is legitimate when you don't even understand how it works? It creates an accountability problem because you don't know who has taken the decision. So Brussels is a city, but there are a number of political actors in Brussels, and it's really, really difficult to know which actor exactly took the decision. And there is a deficit of transparency also in the respect that many political decisions in Brussels are taken in negotiations, and those negotiations mostly take place behind closed doors. So it's, even if they wanted, difficult for citizens to oversee what the EU is deciding. So really one main point that I would see is to increase transparency and accountability in the EU. And I don't mean this like in a formal way, because it's not like there is a lack of formal accountability that much, but it's the sort of visible transparency that citizens feel that the EU is not transparent enough. They feel that if I want to hold someone accountable, I wouldn't even know where to start. And the remedy for that obviously would be a treaty reform, which is let's say, an optimist perspective in the moment. But it would also be to have more public reasoning, more public debates in the EU institutions.
All right. In your article, The War Against Ukraine, the Changing World Order, and the Conflict Between Democracy and Autocracy, you argue that a world structured around the maximum of two hegemonic great powers has been successfully replaced by a world order in which several poles of larger and smaller states confront and compete with each other, politically, economically, militarily, and ideologically. For the EU, this means that its previous global political strategy, which focused strongly on change through trade and its role as a normative power Europe, no longer looks promising. In this multi-order world, what should the EU do to regain its clout and stay relevant?
So I had, in the lecture series that I do every winter term, I invite students to, I invite politicians, academics to the class to discuss with my students. And we had a green MEP from Germany who said about a year ago, the European Union has to decide whether it wants to sit at the table or whether it wants to be on the menu. That's a very harsh way of putting things, but I think there is a point in this quote. And the point is that the European Union really lost in importance and in economic power and influence and in ideological power and influence in the world. And I'm not sure there is an easy answer to how to regain that. I think it's a battle. It's an ideological battle. It's an economical battle. It's probably also a geopolitical battle. And if the EU wants to regain influence, it needs to be attractive and convincing on all these policy fields. So I think it's pretty much of a challenge, and there's not an easy answer, but I think one key issue is credibility. So we have many students from the global south in my university, and most of them would be strongly EU critical. Actually, even my German students or my European students would be strongly EU critical because they think the EU has no credibility in terms of its defense of democracy and human rights. Mm-hmm. So when they discuss the EU's role in everything, well, in non-EU countries, in former developing countries, countries of the global south, etc., there is a huge criticism, so a huge dissatisfaction with what the EU did, saying it's not convincing, they don't stick up to their own ideals, etc. So, so if the EU wants to regain confidence, then they need to, I think, work in that respect. So they really need to work hard to appear convincing and to keep their promises.
In the same article, you argue that there are several signs that liberal democracy is under threat, not only from outside the EU, but from within the EU itself. What does the recent EP elections tell us about the internal challenges of EU against the liberal democratic order?
You mean what EP elections tell us about the internal challenges?
Yes.
Okay, I think that I made that point, I think, quite strongly. So one internal challenge is that we have democratic backsliding in a number of EU member states. To not always only mention Hungary, I read today that there is a new law passed in Slovakia, that restricts media freedom. So they just dissolved the public TV station and created a new TV station in order to exchange journalists that they didn't like because they didn't report on the government in the way that the government wanted, which is exactly what we saw in Hungary and in Poland. And sort of when you look on paper, sorry, the government in Slovakia would be of another political color than the governments in Poland or in Hungary. So we see democratic backsliding in a number of member states. The European Commission does these rule of law reports, and if necessary, they do infringement procedures, so the Court of Justice of the European Union steps in. But this is really exactly the point why I think the EU and the European Commission and any European Commission and Commission president that gets into office needs to be really, really attentive in this way. So in Germany, in the moment, we have a debate on what is called die Brandmauer, so the firewall, not fire stairs or fire exit, but firewall against right-wing extremists. So and it's a general agreement. I hope it will hold, but it's a question how long it will hold, that conservative parties should not be collaborating with right-wing extremists. And I think this is crucial for the European Union and for what we are talking about here, because those right-wing populists that I just mentioned, and also Giorgia Meloni in Italy, she does the same. She limits media freedom. So they are really raising strong internal challenges to democracy in the EU. So very concretely, if center politicians, and I'm counting the EPP here as the center, if they disregard this firewall and if they collaborate with right-wing extremists, it's not only a matter of political color, but it's a matter of supporting democratic backsliding. And that means they are strengthening the internal dangers for democracy in the European Union. And that's, I would say, very, very dangerous, at least as long as one is in favor of liberal democracy.
And lastly, Professor Wiesner, How do you think a likely victory of Le Pen in France would change the EU and European Parliament in particular?
So a likely victory of Le Pen in France would not change the European Parliament like immediately, because the European Parliament has just been elected. So the composition of the European Parliament is set, and a likely victory of Le Pen wouldn't change anything. Then I'm not so sure that there is a likely victory of Le Pen, except for the next presidential elections in France, but these are like in 2 years. I think for the next parliamentary elections in France, it's really a gamble. So I should say that, along with many French commentators, I really didn't understand why Emmanuel Macron called snap elections. I really didn't understand. It's really a bad moment for that. So his party really scored very badly in the EP elections, and I don't see why he should have done that in a moment when the right-wing extremists in France are very strong. But what happened is very interesting. Something that I wouldn't have put my odds on. The left in France united in a record speed. So within 4 days, they had joint lists and they had joint candidacies. So you will see a very interesting opposition in France, and that's an opposition between the right-wing extremists, between Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, and what is called the Nouveau Front Populaire, so the New Popular Front. So it might be that we see a victory of the left. I don't think this is improbable, or that we see a victory of the extreme right. What is really probable is that we don't see very much of a victory of Macron's camp. If we look at the electoral results of the Rassemblement National in France, they are not very strong in the French parliament, because the French parliament is elected in a majority voting system, as according to constituencies, meaning that to win a seat in the National Assembly, you need to win a constituency. And even in this scenario, it's going to be difficult for the Rassemblement National to win a majority of the constituencies, because they are alone. They don't have like that many sparringspartners with them, except probably the party of Eric Zemmour. So really we'll have to see, because there is a right-wing extremist potential of between 35 and 50% in France, yes, but you need to realize it in every constituency. And I'm not like 100% sure this will be the case. So I wouldn't like really set my odds entirely on a victory of the right-wing extremists. But even if they win, well, what would happen if they win? If they win, there would be a prime minister from the Rassemblement National. I think it wouldn't be Le Pen. I think it would be Jordan Bardella, so the young president of the Rassemblement National. And it would mean that there would be another right-wing populist government in Europe, in a big founding member state, along with Italy. So probably they would work very well with Giorgia Meloni. But interestingly, what we see is that the collaboration in the European Union has a kind of moderating influence even on those right-wing populists. So as long as there is no right-wing populist majority in the council, there wouldn't be like such a massive effect. There would be some effect, but the effect would be moderated, because especially there is no right-wing majority in the European Parliament.
All right. Professor Wiesner, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot.